The king beneath the mountain had come, and he was filled with wrath. The valiant man Bard had quickly taken command of the lakemen and led a fierce resistance. Arrows hailed at the dragon, but they were all rejected by his armored scales. House upon house was aflame, and flames unquenchable sprang high into the night. Smaug circled for a while, high in the air above them, lighting all the lake. Then down he swooped, straight through the arrow storm, reckless in his rage. Men gave up their posts, and the town would soon be deserted and burned down to the surface of the lake. Only Bard was left to contest the dragon, and all his arrows but one were spent. He bent his bow for one last attempt. It was in this dire hour that an old thrush approached and spoke of a hollow in the dragon's breast. Amidst of darkness, there was still hope. Smaug swooped once more. The great bow twanged. Smaug was dead, and what that meant, none had yet realized. At the same time as Smaug fell to the bottom of the long lake, the company of Thorin Oakenshield rested uneasily at the guard post of Raven Hill. Thorin, the king of Durin's folk, had led an expedition to the Lonely Mountain, intending to reclaim his kingdom from the dragon Smaug. Bilbo Baggins, the official burglar of Thorin's company, had unintentionally awoken the wrath of the dragon, and the company had barely escaped from the dragon fire. Ever since this assault, Smaug had disappeared, and the company hoped to escape unnoticed back to Lake Town to gather supplies. Unbeknownst to the company, Smaug had been slain by Bard with the Black Arrow. While keeping watch at Raven Hill, the company was suddenly approached by the chief of the Great Ravens, Roak. Thorin was informed of Smaug's demise, but Roak warned also that the dwarves could not yet celebrate. Already the elves of the woodland realm and the surviving lakemen wished their share of the spoil. The lakemen also murmured that their sorrows were due to the dwarves who had awoken the dragon, and that they would find amends in the treasure, even if the dwarves were alive. This induced great anger in Thorin, who desired not to share his grandfather's treasure with anyone, save for his companions. Thorin at once sent a messenger to his cousin, Dane Ironfoot, in the Iron Hills, hoping to inform him of the situation and receive aid. Thorin's company still had some time before the host of elves and men would reach the mountain, for Thranduil, the king of the Sylvan Elves, came to the aid of the sick and dying lakemen. The dwarves now laboured hard in fortifying the main entrance. The days passed, and the elves and men finally camped at the ruins of Dale. To their surprise, the front gate was barred up with newly hewn stone. Messengers from the host approached Thorin, and among them was the Dragon Slayer. Bard respectfully asked for aid to rebuild Lake Town, 1/12 of the treasure of Erebor. Not only was he responsible for slaying the dragon, but he was also the direct descendant of Girion, Lord of Dale, whose treasure had been mingled with the one beneath the mountain. Bard, therefore, had some rightful claim to part of the treasure, but Thorin had been caught by the dragon's sickness. He desired not to share the treasure with elves and men, especially not with the Sylvan Elves who had recently imprisoned his company. An arrow was Thorin's answer, and the messengers declared the kingdom under the mountain besieged. Bilbo Baggins looked upon all of this with great dismay. Therefore, he secretly left the dwarves during the night, and gave the Arkenstone to Bard. Bilbo knew that Thorin valued this artifact above all, and he hoped that Bard could now bargain with Thorin. And Bard did thus the following day, and he showed the Arkenstone to Thorin. But it yielded not, for the dragon's sickness gave Thorin false imaginations, and he was foolishly led to believe that Dane's reinforcements alone would be able to reclaim the Arkenstone. No answer came thus from the mountain, and a one-day ultimatum was given to Thorin. Meanwhile, the host of Dane Ironfoot marched with great speed towards the mountain. 500 grim dwarves, clad in iron, were ready to defend their homeland at all costs. Most of these dwarves were veterans of the Goblin Wars, and they were deadly warriors which wielded two-handed mattocks. The ravens had swiftly flown between Thorin and Dane, and a plan had been made in secrecy. Dane's force would march to the front gate and reinforce the mountain with supplies. The dwarves would now be able to stand a siege for weeks, and by that time yet more dwarves might come. Also, they would be able to reopen and guard some other gate, so that the besiegers would have to encircle the whole mountain, and for that they did not have sufficient numbers. Dane's force rushed through the night, knowing that time was precious. But unbeknownst to dwarves, elves, and men alike, a vast host of terrible goblins had been gathered beneath Mount Gundabad of the north, led by Bolg. When the goblins learned of the death of Smaug, they hastily travelled under the mountains of the north on their way to the Lonely Mountain. They intended to utterly destroy the dwarves and to rout them from the northern part of Middle-earth. Dane's iron-clad warriors finally reached the Lonely Mountain and came up along the eastern spur, and halted, for the road was barred by elves and men. Dane sent out messengers, but Bard, of course, refused the dwarves' passage to the mountain. He doubted that the treasure would be delivered if the mountain was reinforced. Once again, messengers were sent to Thorin, and once again, arrows came. Bard was eager to attack the dwarves, for they could be easily surrounded at present. Unbeknownst to the dwarves, their plans had been revealed by Bilbo Baggins. Bard had thus commanded spearmen and archers to hide behind rocks on the eastern arm of the mountain. But Thranduil hesitated, for he desired not to start a war for gold, and he believed not that the dwarves could reach the front gate as long as they besieged it. But the Elven King reckoned without the dwarves, for the knowledge that the Arkenstone was in the hands of the besiegers burned in their thoughts, and they also guessed the hesitation of the besiegers. The dwarves decided to strike while they debated, and they silently sprang forward to attack. The battle was about to commence, but sudden darkness came on with dreadful swiftness. Bats in their thousands covered the sky. Then Gandalf came out of nowhere and halted attacker and defender alike. "The goblins are upon you! Come! There is yet time for counsel." Gandalf united the forces, and a plan was made. Their only hope was to lure the goblins into the valley between the arms of the mountain and themselves man the great spurs that struck south and east. Yet this would be perilous if the goblins were in sufficient number to overrun the mountain itself and so attack them from behind and above, but there was no time to make any other plan. The forces made their stand, and a little brave resistance consisting of lakemen stood at Dale. The mountain's feet were covered in blackness, and already the vanguard consisting of terrible wolf riders charged into the stout lakemen. But the little resistance was heavily outnumbered, and the lakemen quickly fled back to either side. But Gandalf's plan was successful, for the goblins and wargs now rushed between the mountain's arms. The elves sent a shower of arrows at the hasty goblins, and behind it charged 1,000 spearmen. The rocks were stained black with goblin blood, but more goblins poured in. Just as the goblins were recovering, the mattock warriors of Dane charged in with ferocity, and beside them came the lakemen with their long swords. This attack was devastating for Bolg's forces, and already many goblins were routing. Some wolves turned upon their allies and feasted on the wounded. But just as the defenders had beaten off the first wave, they were caught. The enemy had scaled the mountain and was already on their way down the hillsides. In the valley came Bolg with his fearsome bodyguard, large Uruks wielding scimitars of steel. The goblins charged on all fronts, and the defenders held their ground. It quickly became apparent that the situation was dire at the spurs. Elves, dwarves, and men alike were heavily outnumbered and surrounded. It was in this hour that the trumpet of the mountain was sounded, and Thorin Oakenshield, with company, charged out. Orcs and wolves fell before their axes, and nothing could pierce the shining armor of Erebor. The Matic warriors rushed to aid Thorin, heedless of order. Elves and men came also, and the goblin corpses were piled in heaps. Thorin scattered the wargs, and already clashed into the bodyguard of Bolg. Fierce fighting took place, but Thorin could not pierce their ranks. His numbers were too few, and they were soon encircled. None could come to their aid, for every elf, dwarf, and man was occupied elsewhere. In this dire hour, Fili and Kili fell while defending their uncle. But hope was born anew, for the eagles came out of the sky, and they dislodged the goblins from the mountain slopes and cast them over the precipice. Even with the help of the eagles, the defenders were still outnumbered. But all of a sudden came Beorn the Skin Changer in a massive bear shape, and he bore Thorin out of the fray. Then he returned with a terrible ferocity, and Bolg was crushed. The death of their leader was too much to bear for the goblins. A mass rout took place, and the defenders pursued them eagerly despite their exhaustion. Elves, dwarves, and men drove the enemy into the running river, and pursued them even to the outskirts of Mirkwood. The goblins that ventured that dark path would never return. The battle was decided, but at a high cost. The casualties were heavy for elf, dwarf, and man alike. Thorin eventually perished, for his wounds were beyond healing. Even though the losses were grievous, the outcome was strategically important for the free peoples of Middle-earth. Dane Ironfoot was crowned king under the mountain, and Bard restored the kingdom of Dane. Smaug was dead. Almost all the goblins in the north perished, and there was peace and prosperity for many a year.
I want to give a special thanks to the professional voice actor Liam Taylor for providing his excellent services for this video. If you are interested in lore from Tolkien's Legendarium, make sure to check out these videos right here. Remember to subscribe and consider supporting me on Patreon to show your support.